And hello there, and welcome to Frontiers of Innovation, a LinkedIn and indeed a Facebook Live initiative brought to you by Canon. We're absolutely delighted that you've joined us on the virtual platform from all around the region. Indeed, I see from all around the world. So a huge welcome to all of you. I'm Eithne, Treanor, your moderator for this session. And of course, we want you involved in the session. It is hashtag Frontiers of Innovation. Make sure you listen to our expert guests and make sure that you have a few questions that you can put to them. We'll have some very interesting dialogue, as we always do, really looking at what's going on and what's impacting your world now and indeed in the future. So it's very, very important that you do get involved in this like you always do. So we're really happy to hear from you. Now, our discussion today will center around sustainability. And when you think about it, this is really a wide and embracing topic that matters to just about everybody, personally, professionally, even on the bigger picture when we look around the world. So we're going to have a really good discussion on this, just looking at sustainability, something that we all need to be paying great attention to, you know, not just in times and the fallout for COVID-19, but indeed for the rest of our lives. So I'm really looking forward. Let me introduce our guests to you. Angela Wilkinson joins us. She is the chairwoman and the CEO of the Secretary General, actually. She has all of those titles. So here we are, Angela Wilkinson, Secretary General and CEO for the World Energy Council. Angela, I'm delighted that you've taken the time. Thanks so much.
I'm delighted to be here, Eithne.
Great. And also the Director of Sustainability and Government Affairs for Canon EMEA, also Stuart Poor. So Stuart, thank you both so much. Thank you, Stuart.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you.
Now, if I may talk to you and start with this one too, Angela, when we look at sustainability, and indeed, I think it's a word that we hear from everybody in every profession, personally, a lot of people talk about sustainability. Looking also at the work you're doing at the World Energy Council, give us a feel for where do you see sustainability? What do you think people really need to be looking at?
I wonder if I could put sustainability in a broader context, because when you get to be as old as we are, Eithne, we've been around a while, we understand the bigger picture. So let me try. When I first started work back in the 1970s, we used to talk about growth first. And there was a real polarization at that time between economy and environment. You know, we could have more economy or we could have more environment. And when we went into the 1980s, we started to think that this was rather a false dichotomy, that it wasn't a trade-off. We actually had to find ways of having more environment and more human development. And that gave rise to the Brundtland Commission's work on sustainable development. And if we fast forward to 2015, we saw the United Nations picking up this agenda with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And we went from human development and environment and economy and environment to a framework of 17 different goals and over 250 indicators. So what we do know about sustainable development is it's very much about joining the dots. And the UN's Sustainable Development Goal number 7 is about closing the basic energy access gap, the basic access gap to energy. There are still 850 million people in the world who don't have any access. So energy transition has always been fundamental to the sustainable development journey that we're on. And in the COVID era, we've seen a new muscle coming from what we might call resilience. So now we're talking sustainable development, resilience, and a clean and inclusive global energy transition. And I, as part of that, am talking about humanizing that process, because it's not just about plug-in technologies, it's also about plugging in people in societies to make sure that we move faster, but we don't leave anyone behind.
Indeed, and I think when we look at sustainability, we really need to, it's, you know, the impact at the end of the day is on humanity, and it is on everybody. Stuart, let me bring you in here, and particularly when we look at this perhaps in a corporate environment too, because now we're looking at the need for corporations to make sure that they're very involved in this. And just like as Angela said too, it's not really anything new, but I think people have been perhaps having a difficult time maybe finding the direction that they need to go. You know, when you look at the terminology and just the scope of the issues, where do you see sustainability?
Yeah, thanks, Eithne. So I wholeheartedly agree with what we heard from Angela there. That made a lot of sense to me. There's so much terminology around all of this. A lot of it's quite bewildering, befuddling. I try to keep it as simple as I can, certainly when I'm talking to business people in Canon and anywhere I go for that matter. And really for me, it's about, the way I talk about it is that it's about future-proofing our business against the really big social and environmental challenges and trends that lie ahead. So it's all about future-proofing. That's the key word for me. And that obviously has a strong business case woven into it. So if you look at things like, when you're looking ahead, you're looking at things like resource scarcity, climate change, social movements that move rapidly and unpredictably, population growth, aging populations, trends and changes around mental health, artificial intelligence, robotics, geopolitics. There's so many big things, big weather storms that lie ahead, literally and metaphorically, that we need to be ready for. And so my job as a corporate sustainability person is to think about how on earth we navigate our way through the risks and opportunities that these trends present. And how can we do so in a way that generates value for society while at the same time helping the business to thrive and prosper in the long run?
And exactly, keeping both eyes on terms of the two key areas there. I'll come back to you on that one. But Angela, you mentioned there sustainability and resilience. Is it one or the other? Is it both together? And in fact, I have a few definitions on both, but I'd love to hear what you mean when you talk about sustainability and resilience.
Well, sustainability, I think, has, as Stuart said, become this way of talking about the journey to a future that enables more and many more people, because we have 8 billion or 7.5 billion people today. We expect to have 10 to 11 billion people in the future. So sustainable development has always been about meeting the needs of today without ruining the chances of future generations to meet their needs. And it's a journey, right? We talk about pathways to sustainability. When we talk about resilience, Stuart referred to all these different weather systems metaphorically and actually coming towards us from the future. Resilience is about being prepared to either bounce back from shock or to spring forward, to transform ourselves so that we don't face the shocks that we used to. And this current health crisis is a really, truly human, a shock to humanity. Humanity is being stress tested by the COVID crisis. So when we're addressing how do we manage through crisis and how do we exit from this crisis, we're really much hoping that we don't just survive, but when we emerge from this crisis, we'll emerge stronger, we'll be more resilient, we'll be on a better pathway forward for sustainable development for everybody everywhere. That's the big hope, right? That's how I see it. So sustainability and resilience are related somehow. Not so much in academic terms, in scholarly terms, they sort of fight each other. But in practitioner terms, the world that Stuart and I live in, how do we ensure that as we move forward with global energy transition, we're enabling more societies to adopt a pathway to a sustainable development trajectory, and at the same time become more resilient to the different types of shocks and disruptions that we might face along the way.
And if I can stay with you for a moment, Angela, and maybe continue this discussion about this particular shock, and we're looking at COVID-19 and the impact that this is having. Where do you think, where's been the biggest impact? And I mean, I think in the beginning has proven perhaps that resilience was not there.
Well, I think it's a mixed picture. If we look at the electricity sector, the power sector, the world stopped, the lights stayed on. Who isn't grateful? A big hooray for the power generation sector. They have been proven to be incredibly resilient. But as the crisis goes on, we are asking questions in the energy industry about what do we mean by resilience? It's not just the resilience of the flow of electrons, it's people resilience, the resilience of households, of people, of community, of the supply chain. That's what we're learning. We're learning resilience is no longer just about the technical infrastructure. It's also about the people infrastructure and the systems that are dependent on each other. And companies, when they're responding, we do surveys across the world, they're taking a 3-step approach to the crisis. They're looking at how do they respond to the immediate, how do they rebuild their organisations, because there's a huge unevenness of impacts. Not everybody's been impacted the same way. For some parts of the energy industry, they're in survival mode. They're in cash flow crisis. Other parts of the energy industry, like the power sector, have been incredibly resilient, and they're looking for growth in some areas. And the third area they're looking at is what they call regenerate and recreate, because we see from our surveys of the energy sector that many companies are not just recognising the challenges of survival, but they're trying to realise the opportunity of transformational business developments. They're looking at investments in research and development, investments in resilience, and investments in new ways of working. So they're looking not just to emerge, but transform.
And I think this is giving everybody some time perhaps to step back and really examine what they're doing. And hopefully everybody will emerge a lot stronger out of this. But Stuart, when you look at, how advanced the sustainability agenda was, I suppose, before the pandemic, and, are we seeing perhaps an acceleration at the moment, because we've had probably a bit more time than we wanted to deal with this, and we might have a little bit more time to look at it too?
Yeah, I think I'll kind of pick up on this concept of resilience again here. I think the COVID-19 crisis has exposed an unprecedented level of vulnerability the businesses face to wider societal forces. So in many ways, the outside has come kind of crashing in dramatically, especially in relation to supply chains, and it's just caused ridiculous levels of disruption. So the corporate sustainability conversation now is really about how we can protect against future threats, how we can become more resilient to the bigger disruptions that lie down the pipe, more pandemics potentially, climate chaos, social upheaval. There's clear evidence, though, that we're seeing clear evidence that investors are doubling down on companies that can demonstrate this resilience. So really, an attention to sustainability is seen as a bit of a bellwether through which investors can judge the sort of the health of the companies that they're looking to invest in.
So, Angela, when we look at, what's going on in terms of demand for energy, we look at some of the clean pictures we see of all of the beautiful landmarks around the world, and saying that this fall in demand for fuel, people not traveling, all of that. Some people saying that maybe COVID-19 will actually accelerate the concept, of a greener, cleaner earth, and putting sustainability within this environment. But is this where we really need to be looking, or is this something that's just very short term at the moment?
Well, I think the immediate impacts are short term, and they're not sustainable. Use the word in a different way. I mean, who hasn't looked at the cleaner sky, the clearer skies across cities across the world? I think the photographs of Los Angeles are stunning. You see clouds rather than smog. Who hasn't liked the quiet, uncongested streets and the bird song that they're hearing? And who hasn't liked the clearer rivers that we've been seeing? But maintaining it this way, if we stop the economy, it's the equivalent of stopping breathing to save oxygen. We can't possibly keep human development going if we just stop breathing. So we have to restart our economies. We have to find a way of getting clean and inclusive energy transition as part of the investment strategies coming out of this crisis. And I emphasize the inclusive bit, because we can't just go faster on the pathway to green if we lose 2/3 of the world. 2/3 of the world still need a lot more energy. It's not about less energy, it's about cleaner, more inclusive, sustainable and resilient energy. So we've got to find a way of coming out of this crisis. And we're going to be in a very different context of affordability than we were going into crisis. So we're going to face a global energy transition challenge, which is going to need more clean, more affordable, and it's going to need more inclusive approaches to making sure that everybody can exit and flourish.
And Stuart, when you look at this from a corporate point of view, what can corporations do to make sure that they're actually contributing to that?
Well, when it comes to, first of all, I'd like to say I wholeheartedly agree with Angela's point about this misnomer around consumption and how we recover. For me, the term green recovery is really problematic. It implies that the only way to create clean air on waterways is to completely shut down your economies. Instead, we need to think about a sustainable recovery that balances the needs of environment, communities, and economic security. So yeah, I think some of the language around this debate is problematic. I think when it comes to coming back to sort of clean environments, clean cities, which I think is what you're referring to there, Eithne, then we're looking at low emissions and low waste. I think the emissions agenda is often, we often end up talking about renewables, and that's obviously a big focus for the Middle East, with the UAE using the biggest solar panels in the world right now. But I think we also need to think about energy efficiency. And with the Middle East using 70% of electricity to cool its buildings, then surely building efficiency is a really big issue. We need to think about electrification of ports, moving away from diesel vehicles, and then smart traffic management for those vehicles. And that's something that Canon can support through its network visual solutions. So that's on the emission side. On the waste side, for us at Canon, given the nature of our products and propositions, inevitably we think about electronic waste, and there's a myriad of regulatory drivers that are starting to hove into view that we need to be attending to there. So if you look, for example, Turkey has followed the European Union's extended producer responsibility framework. Saudi Arabia is looking at similar regulations, same in African countries. So, and Africa, of course, is looking very closely at plastics with, I think I was reading 34 out of 54 states have now passed laws banning plastics in Africa, which is extraordinary. So you're seeing some really, really strong moves towards low waste cities as well as sort of low carbon, low emissions cities. And I think companies like Canon and others in our sector and beyond need to be working collaboratively to push that agenda forward.
And again, just staying with you on Canon, and particularly when we think about what do, you're in, the imaging business, you're in high-end cameras, you have kit, you have stuff that perhaps has to be replaced every now and then. Of course, all of the printing solutions, all of that. So you have so much that you do there. So as a company, I mean, how important is it for you that you have built in, I suppose, particularly on the recyclable side of the business and all of that, but recyclable, reuse, but making sure that there's an agenda around the fact that you actually produce equipment that has to be perhaps sometimes discarded. How important is it that a company like yourself, and then like all your peers and perhaps all other companies, really pay attention to this?
It's absolutely crucial, Eithne. So regulation demands it of us increasingly. Customers demand it of us. I work in the EMEA subsidiary of Canon, so the predominant focus for us is very much the end of life of our consumables, our products and packaging. And we need to make sure that we are taking waste out of our operating model wherever possible, keeping materials in use, looking at new models, looking at getting second-hand products onto the market. But in tandem with that, we also need to be working with our counterparts in Canon Inc. to ensure that the design of the products ensures that they are obviously low energy consuming, but also easy to handle and manage at end of life. So yeah, this is no longer a sort of a kind of nice to have. It's an absolutely critical element of our license to operate in the market, and we need to make sure that we're innovating and engaging and collaborating with others to really shift the needle on this wherever possible.
Angela, let me come back to you and talk about, the green, clean future of energy, about renewables, about where we're getting our energy from at the moment, how important that is. And I suppose the language that has often been around this space, where it has tended to become quite divisive in many ways, whereby it's us or them, and unless we get rid of hydrocarbons right now, we were never going to get to that new, clean, green energy future that people are saying we absolutely have to get there. Talk to me about it perhaps being a destination, and also the fact that it might be a bit of a rocky road.
Well, when we started this conversation, we talked about the environment versus economy schism that opened up in the 1970s, and sustainable development came along as a concept to try and bridge that, right? And pathways to a more sustainable human development future. And Stuart's quite right in that we, even in the energy world, we see the future as what we would call customer-centric energy systems. It's about services, not just, nobody wants energy for energy's sake. We like energy because it allows us to do fantastically good things: cook, wash, clean, move, entertain ourselves, light our homes. And what I've seen in the run up to the COVID crisis, we were seeing another schism. We were seeing this schism between what we would call pathways to climate neutrality and the war on carbon. And these are very different things. The war on carbon, there is no such thing as a nice, short, jolly war. And when you declare war on something, it's a very different way to solving something than when you say there are pathways to climate neutrality that we should all be cooperating and collaborating on. So there are more opportunities if you think climate neutrality than if you think war on carbon. You can think about the opportunities for renewables and friends, for hydrogen fuels, for clean hydrogen fuels. You can think also about low emissions technologies. You can think about carbon capture, utilization and storage. You can think about circular economy energy solutions. So, Stuart was talking about not just addressing energy, but also addressing waste. So energy is fundamental to the circular economy. Energy is fundamental to sustainable development. So what we're looking at is, how do we find this new era of cooperation, which isn't just between governments, and it's not just between governments and businesses, with the greatest respect I have for Canon and its role. Governments are very much about should do. Businesses are often about can do, but it's usually about some proprietary technology that they can bring to the table to create that solution. And we need communities. The World Energy Council is a global energy community. Communities change systems. You need to build a community to change a system. And communities are about how to, not should do or can do, but how to. So I think we're entering a new era of cooperation, a new era of international cooperation, which requires us to work across not just countries at government level, but communities that cross borders, that work across different sectors and encompass combinations of technology rather than trying to find the silver bullet solution.
And earlier what you were saying too, Stuart, was, you're responding to the needs and the wants of the community very much as well, and making sure that that's at the forefront. But you've also been working in sustainable development for many years, Stuart. You know this in your background, you've studied this, you've worked in various areas along your career. How have things changed? And are you encouraged, so to speak, that we're getting to the right place, and particularly coming from the corporate side?
I think things have changed. I think that the sophistication of the conversation has changed. People, the business I work in now, you don't have to work anywhere near as hard to press the business case for sustainability. It's well understood. The business value is clear. So people recognise that it's a great way to manage down risk, regulatory and reputational. They've seen how you can eradicate or you can minimise inefficiencies and cut down on waste. But perhaps on the upside also, they can see how you get access to talent in the marketplace. You can talk to your customers in a more collaborative way. And crucially, you can get on the front foot and anticipate new models in the markets, new models emerging from some of those trends I mentioned right at the beginning of this conversation. I think understandably at the moment, perfectly understandably, businesses are in survival mode. I don't think Canon's any different from others in that respect. So it's all about revenue protection. It's about cost management. But sustainability is, as we've already just discussed, a great way to achieve short-term efficiency. But I think also the smart businesses are finding space to consider the long run and think about sustainable, profitable growth. I was reading a PwC report last week which pointed to the fact that the Gulf Cooperation Council countries could save something like $138 billion US dollars from a drive towards the circular economy.
No, I can understand that one. Living here, and particularly on a day like today when, we're 50 degrees out there, we're hitting up 100 Fahrenheit. It's and then it's so cold inside you. You need almost Arctic gear when you go inside. Angela, talk to me a little bit about efficiency, I think, when it comes to efficiency's role in sustainability, because I do believe it's something that particularly here, I can experience it firsthand. But I mean, there are parts of the world, of course, that need to be efficient. There are some other parts then that, you know, would be happy to have that problem, but they don't have it right now.
Yeah, efficiency is great when you're wasting stuff. When you don't have enough stuff to begin with, you need stuff, right? So there are still a lot of places that need more energy. Of course, they shouldn't be using energy in a wasteful way. You want to develop your energy systems to be as efficient as possible, but efficiency gains are not universally spread across the world because some people just need to use more energy and to produce it efficiently, sure. But there's also a trap in efficiency. If you're only focusing on efficiency, we learn efficiency based on what worked in the past. And Stuart talked about future proofing. So you can't manage sustainability just by doing better than you did on what worked in the past. You also have to bring innovation into play. This is Frontiers of Innovation. My goodness, what a great way to have a series. So you have to think about innovation. And what we're seeing in countries that have a lot of energy, I mean, parts of the world, we use the equivalent of 300 labourers a day's worth of energy for one person. In other parts of the world, they have access to one labourer a day's worth of energy. That's themselves. So these are disparities in energy demand. And when we look to the future, we know that we're going to double the global demand for energy over the next couple of decades, and we're going to at least triple the rate of electrification. And we're going to have to find the energy transition is going to have to meet that new tsunami of demand. It's going to have to meet it, but it's going to have to do it in a way where it has pathways to climate neutrality, but it delivers better lives for billions more people. And we can't do that all just by working on efficiency. We have to think about innovation, not just in terms of technologies, but in ways of cooperating and in the design of more integrated policy frameworks. You can't achieve sustainable energy transition just working within the energy ministry or just working in one company or just focusing on one government.
And Stuart, when it comes to policy and it comes to different regulations in different countries and also just the initiative coming from an international company like Canon, you work around the world. Are you finding it easier to actually, implement this concept in some areas and make sure that everybody buys into the concept? And again, when you look at, I suppose, the idea of a green recovery, what do you think that means? And can you get everybody on board?
I think people are increasingly seeing the economic opportunity in a green recovery, notwithstanding the caveats I mentioned earlier. So I don't think that's such a problematic term. On the regulatory side, we're seeing an explosion of activity. I think it is, in terms of the region I work within, we're obviously seeing a lot of activity at a European Union level with the new Green Deal. There's a lot of stuff happening around human rights. There's stuff happening around non-financial reporting. But it's not just in the EU. You've got stuff happening all the way around our developing regions as well, around chemicals, around electronic waste, around plastics. And I think we are encouragingly starting to see a different relationship, or I'm hoping we'll see a different relationship forming between policymakers and businesses. Let's not forget that government has provided an unprecedented level of financial support to businesses all the way around the world, but particularly in Europe and Middle East and Africa. What I've heard described by a colleague recently as the biggest corporate welfare check ever written, I think will create a fundamentally new relationship between businesses and governments. I think it will create a more sophisticated conversation on, at least I hope it will, around how we build back better. And where government bailouts have been tied to sustainability commitments, as we've seen, for example, in France and I think Austria with the aviation sector, then I think that conversation will happen sooner. I think it's a shame that governments haven't done more to put sustainability strings on financial relief. I think there has been a lean in towards fossil fuel companies, perhaps a little bit more than should have been the case. I saw a report today from Energy Policy Tracker that pointed to 120 billion pounds worth of the bailout money being directed towards the fossil fuel industry from the G20 countries. So So that does suggest to me that there could be an opportunity missed there. But we are starting to see a more sophisticated dialogue now. The public and the private sectors are working hand in hand to accelerate our way out of this bind that we find ourselves in, and I think that can only be a good thing.
And indeed, Angela, for many years you've been probably somewhat frustrated by all the talk that's been going on, that you've actually decided to do something about it yourself, and introduce not just another dialogue, but actually you're engaging the World Energy Council in, a really intense, series of conversations. Talk to me a little bit about that too, because the language around what we're doing, I think sometimes not everybody is on the same path.
Well, I think we're launching a new series which we call World Energy Talks, We Talks, and it's trying to reflect our what we think is an urgent challenge to humanise energy transition dialogue. So often the energy transition dialogue focuses on CEOs and ministers, right? Governments and businesses do need to cooperate, but the biggest welfare check to corporations must have dividends to societies, must bring jobs, must bring better livelihoods to everybody. And we need to put more and different voices into the debate on humanising energy transition, because we can't just run down the road towards green and renewable energy if the costs to society of turning the system over faster fall heaviest on the poorer people, and the benefits of investment in renewable energies are reaped by the people who have more ability to pay for putting photovoltaics on their roofs. So we've got to have a fairness in this transition. And the We Talks is really designed to help us understand that you can't push energy transition against society. You've got to pull it with new demand. You've got to pull it with society. And so we need to plug people into this debate, not just businesses and governments, but communities and cities. And we have to plug in people into these We Talks and listen to how we can manage pathways to climate neutrality that help facilitate circular carbon economy pathways to development, that can help deliver lower emissions, but also create better livelihoods for more people. And I think we also need to plug in people in different regions with different regional voices, because we talk in very general terms about global energy transition. But the reality is that regional contexts and situations are significantly different. What constitutes public and private is very different in different parts of the world. And so cooperation mechanisms between government, business and societies and industry need to be different in different parts of the world. And I go back to my point. Governments tend to talk about what we should do. They get elected on a promise to society of delivering a better future. Businesses tend to talk about, business leaders particularly like to talk about can do. We can do that. We can do that. These are the solutions we're bringing forward. Industry tends to talk about how to. And we really need to think about that. The how to has to involve the people who are impacted by transition and working to make it happen. I think that's what we're going to do with We Talks. We're going to listen to voices in industry, not just governments and business. We're going to listen to voices in society, not just government and business.
And I think this is very much at the very heart of what sustainability needs to be, that everybody has to be brought to the conversation and people have to listen to it. It's not about, that there's only one way to go and there's a bit of an us and them. And unfortunately, I think this debate has got there for a while. Now, Stuart, when we look at a company like Canon, you're very community-focused, community very much at the heart of what you do, and you do this around the world. But perhaps years ago, when we looked at this in a business term, this was probably more about just corporate social responsibility. Where do you think now that this has moved into the very heart of what you do as a corporation and really taking it more responsibly? It's almost a license to do business and to actually perform and to be part of society. And this is looking around with your peers and other people you talk to. Do you get the feeling that this is emerging in that right direction?
Yes, I do. I see the whole concept of corporate social responsibility or CSR very much as an old model, and that's not to be disparaging about companies that still describe it as such. But for me, that kind of conjures up a picture of sort of a combination of risk management, philanthropy, community investments. So companies maintaining a license to operate, ticking boxes, but in some cases continuing to pollute and exploit. I think what we're seeing now is the rise of ESG, so environment, social and governance, which is a proxy for sustainability, sustainable development. There's not much between those two as concepts. And that's driven by investor interest, I think, in companies that are demonstrating a long-term receptivity to social and environmental context. So yes, still risk management, that still sits at the heart of this whole enterprise, but much more towards value and opportunity and the room for innovation that generates. Opportunities provided by, as I say, attracting millennial talent into our businesses, accessing new markets, finding new models, new revenue streams. And so I think, as I think I mentioned earlier, this ESG concept is a vital indicator now as to the health and the prospect of businesses, and one that the investment community particularly are really latching on to as an indicator for whether they should be proceeding or not.
Indeed, Angela, when we look at investment in this industry, and we look at investment in any energy products, it doesn't matter, or projects, whatever they are, be they, hydrocarbons, be they new energy, they're long-term, they take a lot of money. Talk to me about where you're seeing, the rise of the essential ESG and actually shareholders talking about this and being interested and seriously interested in it, I suppose, compared to many, many years ago.
Well, I first of all want to say I agree with what Stuart's just said, that there's a difference between what we call the built-in and the bolt-on agendas. Corporate social responsibility was very much about bolt-on. How do you keep fence-line communities at bay? How do you do a little bit of philanthropy? And the ESG agenda has been much more about mainstreaming sustainability to build it in to the core of the enterprise's DNA. And I think the same is true with the investment community. You can find financial investment plays which are built in. They're a little bit of how do we get the fastest return out of the renewable opportunity space as quickly as possible for the benefit of the investor? That's different from what I would call a climate neutrality play, which might be how do we create the greatest value to society in the return of energy transition? And I think there's a danger in thinking that investment, a green fiscal recovery, is only about investment in renewable energy. It has to be investment in the resilience of critical infrastructure. It has to maintain infrastructure. It has to pay for the decommissioning of infrastructure. It has to look at how does it create value for society? How does it create livelihoods? It can't just be about reducing emissions. So I think there's a long way to go yet in the investment, in redirecting investment. And I think we're in a particularly uncertain time. So, we're trying to get people to think about how do you exit crisis and what does your investment play mean for the sustainability of energy transition for society. So not just how do you exit crisis and survive as a company or an investor, but how does your investment also bring benefits to broader society moving forward? So we've looked at not just what we know is going on, but also what do we not know? What are going to be the big uncertainties that shape whether investment works or not as we exit transition? And we find those uncertainties are around very human characteristics: trust, ambition, and control. Trust in terms of the trust between societies and governments. Who's going to be the benefactor of the investment that's being made as we invest in exit? The ambition in terms of where are we really trying to get to? Are we really trying to return to the status quo before the COVID crisis, or are we trying to go somewhere completely different that's more inclusive and better for everybody? And controllability, let's be clear, we're still in crisis. Everybody's very hopeful for a vaccine, but we don't know when we're going to be passing peak crisis. And our surveys indicate that most people expect that even when we pass peak, it's still going to be 12 to 18 months. So we're in a marathon, we're not in a sprint. But often when we talk about investment, we talk sprint, not marathon language.
And stay on that and talk to me a little bit more about the work that you have been doing and these surveys in terms of what are you finding from them? I mean, are you finding just people stuck in a sense of, uncertainty and not knowing what to do, maybe in the marathon that perhaps doesn't have a direction at the moment?
Well, let me use the example. Stuart had talked about the European approach. So the European Commission recently came out with I think it's called Prepare and Repair proposal. I think that's a lovely way of thinking about exit from crisis. It's prepare and repair. And as I said, we find companies tend to take a 3-step model. They do respond, rebuild, and then recreate. Respond, how do we get through? How do we manage through crisis? Rebuild, because we know we're not going to go back to the old normal. We're expecting to go somewhere else. And recreate, because actually we can't get there by doing what we did before. We have to do, as I think Stuart called it, build back better. That's the most common phrase. What we find is that all parts of the energy sector have been impacted and unevenly impacted. But when we look at what companies are doing, they are changing their investments already. They are trying to preserve, first of all, their number one priority is people, which brings the resilience question up. It's not just the resilience of kit, it's about people. They're changing their investment into new business innovation and business models. They're looking at where will digitalization enable them to do things that are very different in ways of working. And they're looking at the opportunity to try and accelerate pathways to climate neutrality, which is, as I said, is not the same as just hammering down emissions. There's this analogy has been made between hammering down the peak of carbon and hammering down the peak of COVID. And I think we're misunderstanding the transition if we try those analogies. We really have to open up the space for more diverse and different solutions that enable more societies to use energy at the same time as create better livelihoods and manage their environment.
A lot to digest there in that one. And again, a lot to think about, but definitely something new whereby we've all got to be actually thinking a little bit more rather than almost in a straight way. This is not the time for, almost that destination thinking. We have so much along the way and so much that's going to actually probably cause some distractions. Stuart, when you look at how businesses have actually responded to this pandemic and particularly, I suppose, worked together, how do you think, and are you encouraged at the way businesses have actually recovered or are recovering, because some of them simply haven't, sadly?
Well, I think the first thing to say is many businesses have made a really important contribution to fighting the virus in lots of different ways. In our own sort of small way at Canon, we did a very interesting thing, which sounds a bit technical, but which is actually really significant. We opened up our IP to organizations that, so we promised to not press copyright on companies that were designing technological solutions to fighting the virus. And that's just one small example of how every company can and should be looking at its people, its technology, its brand, its assets, to explore ways in which it can support.
And the expertise that you have in that area.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And we're looking at some other opportunities as well in the future. I think companies have, I think we've all had to change the way we think and work, I think, and forced to change in a much more dynamic way. So to remote working and then working out how on earth we get back into offices where social distancing isn't necessarily easy. I think we are looking at blended ways of working in the future. I don't think the Japanese corporate community in the past has been particularly prioritizing of remote working. I think that's fair to say. But look at Fujitsu in the last couple of weeks announced that it's moving its staff to 100% remote working, and Canon itself is really well set on this. So we're lucky. We've already invested in a whole bunch of, as you'd expect for a technology business like ours, a whole bunch of digital tools that enable ourselves to work remotely. We've got a naturally collaborative culture. So it doesn't matter where you are. You come together, you work in a collegiate way. I'm based in the UK. I have team members dotted around EMEA, including in, for example, Dubai and Johannesburg, and the communication and engagement is effortless. But we also need to think about, which I think was really the sort of thrust of your question, we also need to think about how we're adapting our business models to shift to this different environment, this different market. So, for example, we've seen an unprecedented spike in people wanting to print at home. And so obviously our inkjet proposition is much more relevant to that. We are seeing a rapid acceleration of digitalization. Again, Canon has lots of solutions in that respect. So we need to adapt from the perspective of how we behave as people, how we manage our people. And Angela's absolutely right. It has to be a people-first strategy, but we also need to think about the fundamentals of our business model and how we can future-proof, there's that word again, future-proof ourselves against the way this trend is spiraling and accelerating.
And indeed, I think, Angela, when we all have had to work at home over the last few months too, and we look at, I think, the rapid pace of this pandemic and the need for a rapid response, in many ways, while we might have cleaner skies and that, we're probably in one way, we're all adapting. So there's sustainability built in one side and perhaps not in another. As you said, lots more people printing at home, the disposal of PPE equipment, the essential use of, hydrocarbons in many ways to just keep the lights on, to keep all those ventilators going, to fuel all of the hospitals, all of that stuff. So it's not an either or if in this one. In many ways, we have to, I suppose, just embrace what happens within a crisis and do our best, I suppose. And some people have perhaps done better than others. What do you think, Angela?
Yeah, I think before the crisis, we were already building up to a couple of stresses, at least on the energy system, I think generally on societies and economies. Most people were looking at a slowdown of the global economy and expecting economic recession. Most people were looking at a build-up of climate change momentum. And most people, I think Stuart alluded to it, were looking at a build-up of social pressures, right? And COVID has come on top of all of those existing pressures. This fundamentally human health crisis. It's a big shock to societies. And it's exposed a great unevenness. It's not just an unevenness in terms of access to energy. It's also an unevenness in terms of digital divides, an unevenness in terms of health systems, an unevenness in terms of who gets stuff and who doesn't get stuff. So I think coming out of the crisis, that's why I think this emphasis that we have, it's not just, it's no longer about the race to green, because green has been about a war on carbon. It really has to be about clean and inclusive, right? Because inclusive matters because of this great unevenness. So for companies are looking, I think when Stuart talks about being mainstreaming sustainability, he means don't just make our operations and our head office safe and clean and green, but let's think about the whole supply chain. And then let's think about our wider responsibility to societies. And businesses can only take that so far, right? They can't, they're not like us. We're a charity, we're a community. So increasingly you need to sit governments around the table because they know what they should be doing for society. That's what they're elected to do. You have to have businesses around the table because they can do, but they can only do so much as a business. And you have to have communities around the table who are going to really build the future together. So to me, it's not about future proofing because we'd have to know what the future is. It's really about building the future that is big enough to include everybody's needs and wants when those needs and wants are very diverse, and doing it in a way where we don't destroy the future for everybody. So exit.
Angela, stay with me. Yes, on a minute here, because I have a question that's come in here from Dominic Stellig. And actually what Dominic's looking for too is when we're looking at, and again, talking about, CO2 emissions. And, as you were talking about, not everybody's having the same opportunities. And he's particularly talking about, the use of coal, the coal usage, if the world is getting serious about CO2 emitters, that, at the moment, unfortunately, what does he say? It's very enthusiastic with the energy transition, but it has to move into a more sustainable way. And again, but how can the World Energy Forum perhaps support on a wider scale communities that actually use coal. And I suppose one that comes to mind, which probably doesn't have equal access to everything, is probably India. But talk to me a little bit about that. How can we get people off coal and move them into something cleaner?
Well, we're already moving off coal, but we're doing it differently in different regions. So in the United States, the economics of coal are lousy, right? You look at Texas, it's the green state. It's no longer the red state because renewables so cheap. There's no space for coal, and the technology is available. So, peak coal in North America is pretty much guaranteed. To understand peak coal in other parts of the world, you have to understand geopolitics of energy still matters, and people need a lot more energy. So I usually talk about this as the problem of what I would call the mosquito and the elephant. We tend to focus, when we're talking about the renewables, on the power system and the electricity. I think it's 20% of energy use worldwide is currently electrified. 80% is non-electrified. We expect that we will triple the amount of electrification in the next decades. But that will still only take us to 40% of the energy system. We still have to meet 60% of needs of most people from other types of energy, heat, liquid fuels, and other things. So my view is if we really want to make sure we go slow, let's keep talking to the coal industry about how they have to close up shop, make people redundant, and go home. If we want to move faster, let's call on the coal industry to be more responsible, come to the table and demonstrate why they deserve to be part of the sustainability discussion rather than excluded from it.
And interesting you talk about that, because we're beginning to see, I think, even from a changeover from perhaps, there's no point closing down a coal power plant and putting the entire village out of work, because then you have clean air, but you have nobody at work. So again, it comes into this humanity dilemma and humanity debate. But again, as you say, getting everybody talking about it and making sure that everyone's coming up with the solutions rather than one or the other. If I can come to you, Stuart, when we look at, regulations that are in some places, and obviously when it comes to coal, regulations have been very powerful for some countries, not for many others. But when we look at the regulations around sustainability and around, the future, how encouraged are you indeed for the future of sustainability, and how close do you think that business needs to work with government to get it right and to get everybody aligned?
I think tighter collaboration is absolutely essential. I like what Angela was saying there about this polarization. We're seeing it politically, socially, but also within sectors as well. We won't get anywhere by just shouting across the fence at each other. We need to come together and really collaborate to address these challenges. As I said earlier, I don't think, and I've been working in corporate sustainability for quite a while now, and I don't think I've ever seen the regulatory agenda move more rapidly than it is now. The level of ambition and appetite that's being thrown into, let's call it a sustainable recovery, is just unprecedented. And in some cases pushing us harder than we had originally planned to go. And that's really quite an interesting dynamic. I think there are all sorts of ways. I think the challenge for us is to think intelligently about how we engage with policymakers. How do we contribute to the discourse in a way that's progressive and helpful rather than adversarial. So, for example, we see some interesting dynamics emerging with regard to public sector procurement. We have a big emphasis on second-hand products, which we want to sell, but the public procurement processes in countries don't always align themselves with the take-up of not brand new products for a variety of complicated legal reasons. So we need to work closely with those public procurement teams to help them realise the benefits of a more circular product. And I think that's really what it's all about. It's coming together, open dialogue, a sharing of challenges, a clear articulation of the barriers, and then a move together forward.
Now, Angela, you get the opportunity to meet a lot of people in every sphere, really. You meet the policymakers, you meet the ministers, you meet the CEOs, you meet the organizations, you meet the NGOs. You're very much, in that, and now you're even expanding that conversation. But whose responsibility is it? If it is anybody's, or is it sort of everybody's? I mean, where does the government sit at this? Should the government be at the heart of legislation and policy, or should we all be contributing towards this?
Well, I think that, first of all, is the role of government is different in different countries because public-private is different. So let me leave that aside. But I think that, what COVID has told us is that societies need governments. I mean, you need governments to step in. So this piece of just the market will take care of everything that came up a few years ago. We see the market taking up great ways of finding solutions, but actually government has to say, where are we and where do we want to go? That's what it's about. That's why I say governments are about the should do. What does better mean, and where do we want to go to? They're the destination setters. I think businesses are part of the pathway developers. They're the can-dos of this. But we mustn't lose sight of society needing to be at the table either. And there's a wider set of policy shapers. And increasingly, if you want to address energy transition, I pick that because we used to think energy transition could be solved by looking at the energy ministry and the energy industry. But nowadays, we know that the boundaries between these sectors are blurring. There's this strange thing called sector coupling. And moving forward, energy transition is going to have to, we have to address the health, the cyber, and the energy nexus, because we're moving with digitalization, working from home. We're moving towards, we want sustainable energy, and every vaccine needs a fridge, and every fridge needs a power system. So the challenge is not policy makers, but the challenge is integrated policy frameworks. Many governments are siloed, they do single issues, let's solve a problem by taking it apart. We're learning as a world, how do we solve connected challenges and who needs to be at the table? And it's a broader group of diverse interests and needs. And to do that, you can't be the government to convene it, and you can't be a business to convene it. You've got to convene it in the space between business, government, and society. So I think we're going to see new ways of cooperating, and we need strong communities with agile institutions, not strong institutions with weak communities.
And as a closing thought, do you think we're getting close to that, or what can be done to really push us there?
Well, I think we've been having a go for 100 years, and we're still having a go. And I think you do see movement. You hear the language of coalitions, you hear the language of constellations, you hear the language of multi-stakeholder, multi-dimensionals, multi-stakeholders, multi-sectoral. And I think the question is, you have to think of these as problems. There's a problem space and there's a neutral space for convening. You can't solve the issue if you take a government first agenda or a business first agenda or a society only agenda. You've got to solve them by connecting these things. And fundamentally, sustainable development was around connecting the dots and connecting the people and the organizations that need to be working together to move the journey forward.
And Stuart, I'm going to leave you a closing word on that in terms of like your work over your career. Are you more encouraged and more optimistic about sustainability for the future and that corporates are doing it right?
Yeah, I'm always positive. I think the way I look at this is, look how we've reacted to this as a business community. We've had to shift, so it's not been negotiable, but we've, on a really simple level, we have shifted tens of thousands of people out of the office into the home, and by and large, it's worked. So arguments against decarbonisation, against diversity and inclusion in the workforce, against meaningful mechanisms to tackle modern slavery, they just don't wash anymore. They're hard to do, but we've shown that we can change rapidly, and we need to embrace that capability and apply it to a multifaceted range of issues across the sustainable development spectrum.
So indeed, it's a very dynamic and, a very exciting space to be in at the moment, because I think it's without a doubt, listening to you both, so much to be done. We're heading in the right direction. We may be sometimes taking sort of 3 steps forward, hopefully only 1 back, and getting there, quicker than we need to do, because it's something without a doubt. I think that the political will is there. the commercial will is there. And I think it's also been driven by investors and driven by society. And coming back to it, ultimately, it's a big human story. And it's one, I think, which will be ultimately, which Angela will love to hear, driven by humanity. We have to wrap it up there. Angela Wilkinson, thank you so much for joining us. And to Stuart Poore also, thank you both for being with us. And indeed to all of you at home, sorry we didn't get time to get all your questions in there, but we're delighted as always to have you live on LinkedIn, on Facebook. We've been working on Twitter as well, putting some messages up there, just keeping you up to date with what everybody is saying. And this series, of course, will continue looking at innovation, creativity, digitalization. We'll be back with you next Wednesday at 1800 here in the UAE. And indeed, in the UK, we'll be back at about 1500. So be sure and join us next week for another engaging and inspiring discussion. In the meantime, stay safe and stay in touch. From Frontiers of Innovation, thank you so much.